Now, Dr. Shatzer is a graduate of Union University in Jackson, Tennessee, and Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And in 2014, he earned his PhD from Marquette University in theological ethics. Currently, he serves as the Associate Dean of Theology and Missions at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee, and he teaches courses on Bible, theology, and ethics. Tonight, Dr. Shatzer is speaking on technology and the future of Christian discipleship, the challenges and the opportunities. And of course, this is based on his book, Transhumanism and the Image of God, Today's Technology and the Future of Christian Discipleship. Now, in the book, Dr. Shatzer challenges us to carefully consider the future of Christian discipleship in a disruptive technological environment, and exploring topics such as artificial intelligence, robotics, medical technology, and communications tools. He examines how everyday technological changes have already altered and continue to change the way we think and relate and understand reality. Increasingly, technology addiction is a major problem in our society, and there are few contemporary issues more important and more relevant to Christians of all ages, from middle school students to older adults. And so I would highly recommend and encourage everyone to read Transhumanism and the Image of God, whether you have a particular interest in technology or not. It truly is one of those topics that we really need to know. And as I read it, I found it to be not only informative and engaging and insightful, but even prophetic. And I came to the conclusion that Dr. Shatzer truly qualifies as a philosopher of technology. So it's a great privilege to have him here with us this evening, and please provide a warm welcome to Dr. Jacob Shatzer.
All right, well, thank you for having me. Give me a moment here while I get this PowerPoint pulled up. You might be here tonight, and if you're like most Christians, I think when you see the word transhumanism, you think, I'm not into that. I'm not interested in transhumanism. Ah, good, there we go. You think, oh, that's something for somebody. Oh, I know someone who's really into technology. Maybe they're interested in transhumanism. So when I come up here and I start and I put this slide up and it just says transhumanism, you're already thinking, oh, all right, here we go. But it means that I have you right where I want you, if that's what you think. I think one of the reasons that I wrote this book is that I think most Christians, if they know anything about transhumanism or posthumanism, as you may have heard, they're related terms, I'll talk a little bit in a moment about them, tend to think, that's not for me. Transhumanism at root is basically about the idea of taking whatever tools we have available to us, whatever medical technologies we have available to us, whatever pharmaceutical enhancements we have available to us, and take control of the human course of evolution and move beyond what we currently are to something else, something later. Of course, the popular cultural depictions of this tend to circle around ideas of somehow existing forever inside a computer, or something like that, which I'm sure if we had a sign-up sheet in the back that you could, for free, exist forever inside a computer, most of us would say no, we don't want to. But what I want you to see tonight, what I hope I can show you tonight, is that actually the values of transhumanism, the things that they're building this off of, the things that they think are important, the attitude that transhumanists have toward technology actually isn't that far off from how many of us think about and interact with technology on a daily basis. In other words, right now, you might not think that you are a candidate for becoming transhuman, but actually the way that we use our technology uncritically day in and day out is teaching us, is training us, is maybe discipling us to have the very same values that the transhumanists have. So we're going to get there. We're going to talk about transhumanism, but first we're going to start somewhere completely different. And I tell my students on the first day of class, which we started class again last week, I always tell my students there are 2 rules in my class, trust me and play along. And that's usually exactly what they do. They kind of laugh at me. But I ask the same for you, from you tonight, because we're going to start somewhere that might seem a little strange. We're going to start in Daniel 6. And many of you know Daniel 6. Daniel 6, of course, is the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel in the lion's den, though, is later in the chapter. When you read the beginning of the chapter, you probably, like me in the past, have thought, oh, this is just the lead up to the cool part, Daniel in the lion's den. You probably read through it quickly and didn't think much about what was going on, besides getting onto the part in the story where he spends the night with lions. But I want to read the first 10 verses or so of Daniel 6 and point something out to you that's going to be helpful and important for us as we go forward tonight. Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. These satraps would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the whole realm. The administrators and satraps, therefore, kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. But they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, we will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God. So the administrators and satraps went together to the king and said to him, may King Darius live forever. All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors, have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days, anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish this edict and sign the document, so that as a law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed. So King Darius signed the written edict. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. It goes on to talk about Daniel praying, of course, and then the repercussions of his prayer. But I want you to think with me for a moment about where it leads off. I want you to think for a moment what you would do if you were Daniel. If you're Daniel and you hear about this new law, what would you do? Look at the beginning of the chapter as I read. This is Daniel. All right? He is, we know from the first 5 chapters of Daniel as well, he's a high-ranking, wise government official. He's a valued member of this administration. His colleagues have lied, right? They told the king that all of the administrators, which would have included Daniel, liked the idea of this law. So his colleagues have gone to his boss and lied. I think if I'm Daniel, I just go ahead and try to take control of the situation, right? He's one of 3 that are right under the king. It's not like he's a random person out there. He knows the king. His office is probably just down the hall. If I'm Daniel, I think I take control of the situation, and I go and I talk to the king and I say, hey, look, they lied. Surely we can change this somehow, right? I would have tried to do whatever I could do to make things right, because I would want to maintain my influence, right, for the sake of God and God's name. But that's not what Daniel does. Daniel doesn't take control. Daniel simply obeys God and does what he always does. He prays. He prays with his windows open toward Jerusalem, the text tells us, which means that he does his prayer in such a way that reminds him that even as a high-ranking government official, he serves a different kingdom. Right? He serves God ultimately. And then through the rest of the story, which we all know from Sunday school, probably, if you're like me, flannel graphs. Anybody remember flannel graphs? Right? He goes in the lion's den, he comes out unscathed, and through that, God's name is made known and made great throughout the land. Right? Daniel could have never planned that. Daniel in his wildest dreams couldn't have set up such an evangelistic campaign. So why are we starting with this story? The reason that we're starting with this story is that Daniel gives us a really clear picture here that control is not always something we should grab after. Control is not always something that we should want. Now when I start talking like this, I'm starting to sound a little strange. We were all with me when we were talking about Daniel, but now I'm saying that control maybe isn't always good. Where this connects to our talk tonight and thinking about transhumanism and thinking about technology is that one of the things technology it teaches us is that control is always better. Some of you right now might be able to pull out a smartphone and change the temperature in your living room. Complete control, right? Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing necessarily to have control over your temperature in your living room. Right? But what I'm trying to highlight is that we just assume, we just go right along with this story that more control is always better. Right? More control is always better. It's one of the things that technology is really good at discipling us into, because technology offers us control. Now, I'm not saying that we should be totally out of control or that any type of control is a bad thing. What I'm just trying to help us see here is that maybe we take something for granted that we shouldn't take for granted. Maybe control isn't always a good thing. So what I want us to ask here is, how can our use of tools perhaps encourage and shape us to assume control always, rather than taking a posture of obedience and faithfulness? Right? What might this look like? What do we need to watch for as we think about the way that technology shapes us? So some of you might be thinking, well, hold on a second. We're talking about technology. We're talking about transhumanism. Technology has been something that we've been dealing with, like humans have always had to deal with new technologies, right? Complaining about new technologies today isn't any different than griping about the printing press, or Plato wasn't super happy about people writing things down, right? He thought it was going to ruin their memories. So is this just the same thing again? I think on one level it is. On one level, we can acknowledge that humans have always had to think about the tools that we use and how we can use those tools well, and how we can avoid using those tools poorly. But things have changed, I think, or I want to argue anyway, with digital tools in particular. I'll often kind of just refer to a smartphone, not because it's the evil that is after us or the only form of technology, but it's a specific form, and a form that many of us have and many of us can think about and identify with. So when we think about a smartphone, we can see some of the ways that these things have changed. First of all, the speed of access to information and the speed of access just to the tool that we have and our immersion in it is different. I mean, compare the smartphone to a hammer. The smartphone, there's a 24/7 nature to it, right? There's probably not many people sitting across the table from their family at dinner, ignoring their family because they're twiddling with their hammer, right? No, it's not as immersive, right? It's a tool that has its purpose, but most people are putting it down when that purpose is gone. It's not one that constantly demands to grab our attention. There's also a 24/7 nature to this. I mean, we see this in instances, especially with kids, right? With bullying. Like some of you may remember like bullies in school. Like I remember some bullies in school, elementary school, they're tough guys. They might pick on you a little bit, but then, you go home from school, you might cry to your mom. I didn't, somebody might though. And then, the next day you go back into it, right? Well, what do we see with bullying today? I mean, this is something that's just clearly in the news, and we obviously see that there's a problem here. There's this 24/7 nature to it, right? Because many of our kids are so immersed in technology, they can't get away from the bullies, right? They can't even just get home from school and decompress and be encouraged. The bullies are there too. Right? So there's this 24/7 nature. Now, I'm not saying bullying is the fault of the smartphone. It's not, right? I just talked about bullying before smartphones. But we can see that digital technology, the internet, the availability of these things, the speed, the immersion in them seems to be posing some new challenges, some difficult things. Businesses certainly see this, right? There's a growing literature for businesses, for advertisers especially, to learn how to use technology, to use digital technology, web browsing, your smartphone, everything to just sell you things, right? I mean, the language of unprecedented opportunities is what is often thrown around. There are unprecedented opportunities, not just to sell, but to modify, guide, and change your behavior in order to sell you something, right? So this speed of access and immersion is one of the reasons that I think that when we think about technology, we need to be careful not to just think, oh, this is just like any other tool before, we'll figure it out, no big deal. Second, as Dr. Bashir's mentioned, there are addictive characteristics that are coming out. The more and more we see the way people interact with these devices. Many studies are finding comparisons with substance addiction. The same problems that we see with substance abuse are showing up in the way people are interacting with digital technology. Are people addicted to the devices themselves? Are they addicted to the affirmation that they get when people like their Facebook posts? I don't know. But we see these addictive characteristics coming. In a way, again, the fun comparison is the smartphone to the hammer, right? I don't know anyone that I've ever would say, like, I think they're addicted to a hammer, right? But we see these addictive characteristics coming out more and more with technology. And a side note here, I was talking about this with Dr. Bashir today. One of the problems with things like these addictive characteristics is it's really easy to say, oh, come on, what studies are you talking about? How long are those studies? Right? I mean, we know standard studies, especially to chart effects over time, take a really long time. And the smartphone is really like 12, 13 years old. One author that I read, I think Mary Aiken is her name, talks about this in relation to children. And she basically says, you know what, you're right. We do need a lot more studies to know for sure how addictive this stuff is, how much it's harming our children, how much it's changing our brains, how much it's impacting our behavior. You're right. We need some 30-year, 40-year studies. But everything we see right now is pointing to the danger, and I don't want my kids to be the guinea pigs, and I don't want to be one of the guinea pigs. So in other words, we're at this place, just as a society, where we have to acknowledge that there's certainly more knowledge that we can get on the impact of digital technology on us. But at the same time, we recognize that the signs are pointing to these profound changes, behavioral changes, cognitive changes that we should be aware of, because just wisdom points to thinking about it now before some of those results are even in. Finally, another thing that has changed is captured well by this term technological people. And I'm going to read you a quotation I'm going to put up here in a moment that helps make sense of this. But at root, before I read the quote, what technological people gets at is the way, for whatever reason, digital technology is very good at co-opting us into its values and substituting its values for our values. Now, another little side note here. I'm not saying there's like 3 men in a dark room somewhere engineering all of this, all right? And I know that technology is not like a person. So when I say technology is doing this, I'm speaking a little bit metaphorically there. So I don't have this grand conspiracy theory of like 2 people in control of this whole thing, but what we do see is the way that technology does bring values with it. And we get pulled into those values. And that's where this term technological people comes in. So Ron Srigley says this: there's nothing wrong with technology per se, but there is something wrong with technological people. The difference between the two is that technology is merely a tool used to pursue substantial human ends, whereas technological people abandon human ends in favor of exclusively technological ones. The former view is classical, the latter that of Silicon Valley dataists and transhumanists, for whom human beings are themselves merely obsolete algorithms, soon to be replaced by synthetic ones far superior to them in every way. So this notion of technological people then gets at this substitution of ends. In other words, it changes us in what we're going for and what we're thinking about, what we care about. It is a way of talking about what I started with Daniel, with that notion of control. We see, and if you're like me, you admit, I want to be way more in control than I should. Now, I'm sure I would want that control even without digital technology, but digital technology inflames that in me. I want that control, right? But you know what? Being completely in control is not what God created us to be. It is not a substantial human end. Our proper end is not to be in control, but to be obedient to the God who is in control and to trust Him, right? So we can see here how those sorts of things can begin to sneak in, even in small ways. I want to introduce to you two fancy terms that if you don't like, you can get rid of them. But I like giving people fancy terms because then sometimes the term is so weird that it actually helps you remember the concept. So the first of those is technosocial engineering. So these two scholars, Brett Frischman and Evan Selinger, have written this book, Re-Engineering Humanity. And they argue that there is technosocial engineering going on. Now, you probably are familiar somewhat with the idea of social engineering, right? So what's technosocial engineering? It's basically the idea that there are processes in which technologies and social forces align and impact how we think, perceive, and act. In other words, what Frischman and Selinger are getting at and documenting in their book is that technology by itself is having an impact, but there are also these social forces that are at work, and when you align them together, it ends up having more of an impact on us, on the way we think, perceive, and act. That sounds interesting, I hope. I think it's really interesting, but there's a problem with this. That's where the second term comes in, and this one might be less helpful. But acute technosocial opacity. Shannon Valor, who's a philosopher of technology, takes this idea of technosocial engineering, not from those two, her book was earlier, but she hits at some of these same ideas about the way technology and social forces are impacting us in ways that we don't recognize. And she says, part of the reason this is so difficult is because it's so hard for us to see, because we don't want to notice it, and we're not primed to notice it. It's dark to us. It's behind a curtain. We're blind to it. It's hard for us to see what we need to see in order to make good decisions. So what Valor argues is that we need to slow down, notice, and look closer, as well as using wisdom as much wisdom as we have to trace the trajectories that we might be taking. So what I hope that you've seen so far is first of all, that there are ways that digital technology needs more careful attention than maybe previous types of technology did, simply because of how immersed we are in it and the impact that it's already having on people. And that impact is not just obvious and on the surface, it also combines in some ways with social forces and ideas to shape us in ways that we're not even aware of. And so if we're going to seek to follow Christ, if we're going to seek to be Christian disciples in an environment like this, we need to learn to think about the ways that we might be being drawn in these other directions. So how does this connect to the values of transhumanism? To address that, we're going to talk about death. Here's a great quote from a transhumanist. Humans die due to some technical glitch. The heart stops pumping blood. The main artery is clogged by fatty deposits. Furthermore, every technical problem has a technical solution. We don't need to wait for the second coming in order to overcome death. A couple of geeks in a lab can do it. If traditionally death was the specialty of priests and theologians, now the engineers are taking over. What we see here is that while there is impact in the way we're interacting with our technology and the various ways that it's interacting with social forces, there are also people who are seeing this potential and are saying, hey, let's push this through. We can defeat death. We can overtake all of these problems that we used to previously have. That's where we're beginning to see where the notion of transhumanism comes into play. So as I mentioned earlier, if we talk about transhumanism in the broadest sense, we can talk about philosophers, pragmatists, technologists who are interested in grabbing the horns of evolution. So it's built on an evolutionary worldview that says there really isn't anything that counts as human, like full stop. Humans have always been evolving and will continue to evolve. So basically, we're going to be different anyway, so let's just grab the bull by the horns and let's decide how we want to be. Let's do this in order to move beyond the problems that we have and maybe move beyond them more quickly than we would if we just let them be. So what are the values then in this particular perspective? You might notice with these 5 values that I've put up that they don't sound as far out there as transhumanism on its own might. First, one of the values of transhumanism is the idea of perpetual progress. The idea that things are getting better and will continue to get better, and we should pursue that. We have a track record as humans of making things better, and so we should be hopeful that we can continue to do that. That value combined with the second value, intelligent technology, you can see how they would argue that we should take advantage of this intelligent technology to spur this progress on. All right, now, some of you might think, we were talking at dinner with some of you, well, you know, everything wears out and breaks. How would we think that we could be immortal if we were in a machine? Machines break, right? Well, they do, but part of what they're thinking here with the values is just as technology has increased so much in the last 50 years, in the next 50, 100, 150, it's going to get even better. And so this intelligent technology and perpetual progress is something that we can count on and we can hang our hope on, and that will potentially provide immortality for us. Now, we're going to get to this a bit later, especially about how can we even say that, you know, uploading a mind into a computer, what would that even look like, and things like that. But we'll get there. The other 3 values are all kind of connected. There's a value of the open society, right? So there's a libertarian streak in transhumanism that we see in this open society, self-direction, and rational thinking. The idea is rather than getting distracted by laws or human mores or traditions or the ick factor, people should just be able to experiment with whatever they want, to do whatever they want to do, to become whatever they think they might want to be, hopefully guided by rational thinking, and then we can see how these things will come together and provide opportunities for future generations. Now that we've established some of these values, I want to walk through what I typically describe as 3 steps or 3 places on a spectrum related to transhumanism. But I have to kind of give us some concepts here to play with. First, there's the idea of a meat suit. Okay, meat suit, M-E-A-T space S-U-I-T, meat suit. It's what we all have. We're all here in our meat suits. This is the somewhat flippant language that many transhumanists use to refer to the body, because, of course, if something is a suit, you know that it can be changed. And you might look a little different, but it's still you, right? So you have the meat suit. And with transhumanism, there is a move away from the meat suit, but it's not just immediately the highest modification abandoning the meat suit. That's the goal, right? Like you said, bodies wear out. But in transhumanism, as we look at the elements of transhumanism, and as we think about how our use of technology actually helps us think some of the same things that they do, we have to start a little bit before totally abandoning the body. So the first element of transhumanism that I want to talk about is what's referred to as morphological freedom. So this is the lower modification end of the spectrum, right? Lower modification, we're in morphological freedom. This is basically the idea for transhumanists that you have the freedom to change your body in any way you want to change it. Right? So morphological there is talking about changes to the body, and there's a freedom to do that. So morphological freedom means the ability to take advantage of whatever technology a person wants to, or you can add in there tech enhancements or pharmaceutical enhancements. Oftentimes when it comes to drugs, they're talking about brain booster drugs, right? Maybe you've read about some of these supplements that supposedly make you think faster. And there was that movie with Bradley Cooper that I don't think anyone saw. I forget what it's even called, where he does that. What was it? Anybody? Limitless, yeah, where he's got some of these pills. Did you see it? Okay, well, I think you were it, maybe. Right, so those kind of pharmaceuticals. So the idea basically with morphological freedom is you should be able to utilize any of these things in any way that you desire. And it's a right in the thinking of the transhumanists, because you have a right to life, right? You have a right to happiness. You have a right to freedom. You have a right to your own body. So you should have the right to modify your own body in any way that you want. The example that I often use here, because it still seems absurd to me, maybe it shouldn't, but in some of the literature it talks about a woman who wanted a tail. She wanted to have a tail. And so according to the principles of morphological freedom, she should be free to have a tail. We should help her get a tail. And then, see, it's going to be to our advantage, because you might think, like me, that you don't want a tail. But wait till you get to know her with her tail. You're going to realize you too want a tail, right? And then, through technological advancement, we can have better tails. We can make the connection between person and tail quicker and easier. We can have mall kiosks where you can get a tail while shopping, right? The idea with this is there's no sense of what it means to be human. Once you've abandoned any standard for what it means to be human, then it just comes down to desire and want. So someone who wants a tail should be able to have a tail. And this, again, the key thing to remember here is this is a right. This is a right. So if we're depriving anyone of the right to have it, if we're depriving anyone of this desire to have a tail, get their tail, we're taking away their rights. We're taking away something that belongs to them. This also, morphological freedom would refer to some of the more minor enhancements that people seek to do to themselves. So there's a large and growing community around the world of what were often referred to as biohackers. So people who are basically interested in experimenting on their own bodies with these sorts of things. Some of the most common biohacks are, you have a credit card where you can tap to pay. Does anybody have a tap to pay credit card, or a phone that you can tap to pay? There's basically an RFID chip in there. There are people who experiment with embedding those in their skin, right? So they put them under their finger maybe, and then once it heals, they can go to Starbucks and they can literally tap to pay, right? Or many companies will use RFID on your name badge to get into the building, right? So you need the name badge to get in the building. Well, you could embed that right in your hand, and you could just walk up to the door and you'd be in, right? Now, you might be thinking, well, why would you need to do that? Well, it doesn't matter. They have the right to experiment with this how they want to experiment with this. And many of them see themselves as basically serving future generations by experimenting on their own bodies and seeing what works and what is useful. So morphological freedom is that first element of transhumanism. As far as the way that we might be impacted to think like this, what sort of techno-social engineering might be going on that would nudge us in this direction? We can all laugh about somebody wanting a tail, but when we think about something as simple as virtual reality and the way we interact with virtual reality, the norm in virtual reality is you can choose who you are and what you want to look like. In other words, it starts to get us to toy with this idea that who I am has absolutely nothing to do with my body that God has given me. Who I am is something else, something inside, which doesn't even make sense because inside, we won't go there right now. Right, it begins to make us think of this. It makes us think self-creation. Yeah, I can create I can create myself. If I want to have a tail, I can have a tail, right? And we get the same thing on a slightly different level with social media, right? Social media encourages us to project a self of our own creation. Now, we're seeing some reaction against this as more and more people will just post really painful and boring things from their lives too. But especially, most of social media is this self-project, look, very curated, this is who I am. right? Which again, isn't the same thing as getting the tail at the mall kiosk, but it's still nudging us to think our bodies are something that we should take control of and define by our own desires and nothing else, right? So let me be clear. I am not arguing that if you have social media or if you play a virtual reality game, you're going to end up with a tail. I'm not arguing that. But what I'm trying to help us see is just as we all realized early on that we would take way more control than Daniel probably would, that this notion of we create ourselves, what we are our body is somehow distinct from who we really are, we buy into that actually probably more than we want to acknowledge. And we need to catch ourselves when we're starting to buy into that. And we need to have something true, something positive to reinforce, to bring us back to who God has revealed that we are. All right, the second step then is augmented reality, or you might use the term cyborg here. So this is the middle step. We've got you can do whatever you want with your own body. Then this middle step of augmented reality or cyborg type stuff. What we're getting at here is where there becomes a more even distribution between what we would call the meat suit and the computer suit, right? So with augmented reality, we see this with virtual reality being completely different from the real world. Augmented reality is basically digital overlays on the real world. So I could have smart glasses. These are not smart glasses. They're just normal glasses. But I could have smart glasses that were maybe connected into some different social media applications and maybe also some city info, right? I've been to Atlanta a few times, but not this area, so this would have been useful, right? I could have come here and I could look at each of you and it might have data on you, so it would just pop up and right next to your face it would say your name and maybe some stuff about your background that would be helpful for me. It would smooth our interactions out, right? And when if I was walking around or something in town, I could be told, I could see restaurant reviews as I walk by, or I could see like a big red X where I should not turn because it's a rougher part of town maybe, right? And back to the example of you, there might be information in here about you that you were actually hoping I didn't know tonight. But now I know, right? And so you can see where this augmented reality idea on the one hand starts to get into some stuff that seems just obviously helpful, but also is tied in with some things that we think, I don't even know how would we even regulate that? Or what are the implications of that, right? We haven't even begun to think those things fully through. I mean, some people have in the design area, but like with much of technology, it outpaces our reflection on it. So many of these things are going to be here before we're able to reflect on some of these uses. So with augmented reality, then, we have this hybrid happening. And as one, actually the same guy I quoted earlier, Noah Harari, brings this point home. And the reason that this middle one, to some of you, I've just talked about augmented reality and glasses, and you're like, that seems a little less of a big deal than the person with the tail. Why is this a step up? The step up is, augmented reality is just an example of this fusion between the digital and the real. And it's ultimately a fusion that wants to remove the distinction completely. Harari puts it, devices such as Google Glass and games such as Pokemon Go, which was an exciting game like 4 years ago, are designed to erase the distinction between online and offline, merging them into a single augmented reality. On an even deeper level, biometric sensors and direct brain-to-computer interfaces aim to erode the border between electronic machines and organic bodies and to literally get under our skin. Once the tech giants come to terms with the human body, they might end up manipulating our entire bodies in the same way they currently manipulate our eyes, fingers, and credit cards. We may come to miss the good old days when online was separated from offline, right? So what we're seeing with this middle step is this merging of the computer and the biological, the merging of the offline and the online in such a way that the distinction disappears. We still, I think for the most part, experience like the real world and then we're online sometimes, right? But I think that we're going to look back at some point and tell our kids or grandkids or whatever, I remember when I could go offline. Right? So there's this fusion that's happening that, again, we could identify some good things about that, but we also need to be wary of some of the ways that could be harmful. All right, the third step I have the least time for, and that's fine because it's the most science fiction and out there, and that's the development of artificial intelligence and mind uploading. And the reason that I treat them together is that obviously, artificial intelligence is not human intelligence, and there's, of course, a huge debate about how advanced artificial intelligence is even going to get. Right now, it's just really good at identifying patterns in data sets and then replicating those patterns and tricking us into thinking it's smart, right? So we have very narrow artificial intelligence that can do things like vacuum your house, right? Anyone admit to having a robot vacuum? Anybody? Right? We don't worry about you're not worried that you're going to go home tonight and your robot vacuum is going to have left and it's like traveled and he's like joined the circus or something, and you're like, oh, not another robot vacuum joining the circus, right? That's kind of the next step in artificial intelligence, which maybe is too much of a joke to take seriously. But the idea of artificial general intelligence, where an artificial intelligence can actually grow and learn and develop, much like human intelligence does, there is vast disagreement on whether that is even possible. But the reason that I put it here is because with the growth in artificial intelligence, we are all becoming more used to interacting with artificial intelligences, right? Hey Siri, right? Go back like 15 years. Like if you could bring someone just 15 years forward and drop them into your house and then they're like, who's Alexa? Right? Like it's strange, but it's so normal now. It's not weird at all to see someone saying, "Hey Siri," right? So the development in artificial intelligence, I think, matters here because as we think about a future existing inside a computer, I think people who have become used to interacting with artificial intelligences actually will think that maybe an eternity inside a computer wouldn't be so bad, right? Because they're used to, I'm used to interacting with robots. I'm used to interacting with artificial intelligences, right? It's blurring that line even further. So when it comes to mind uploading, this is another place where there is just vast scientific disagreement on whether this is even possible. Let's suppose I could suddenly, well, first of all, there are some steps you have to take. First of all, you have to believe that everything about your mind is somehow contained in your physical brain, and that we could digitize it. We could turn all of the biological cells and neurons and all that in your brain into zeros and ones. So you have to believe that. And then you have to believe we somehow can do that and get that information out and store it somewhere. Right now, with someone last night mentioned quantum computing, right? There are some big advances in computing that are on the horizon that could potentially make data storage and things like that more realistic for that much information. But anyway, let's just assume we can do that. And let's pretend it's shaped like a water bottle. And this is my machine that I can upload your mind, right? So I scan. Well, I'll keep just using Dr. Bashir's as my example. Can scan his brain somehow with this, and then I have it. I have his mind here. Well, guess what we now have? We have two Dr. Bashirs, right? We still have the one back in the meat suit, and now we have Dr. Bashir's mind in this machine, right? Now, I know this isn't a machine at all, but it's the only prop I have, so we're going to go with it. I guess I could have just said it was in my computer, right? That would make more sense. It's okay. In other words, even when we get really theoretical and think what we might be able to do, all we get to is some sort of cloning of the brain. And that doesn't eliminate the existing brain. So it's not like you're like, okay, I'm going to go in for my mind uploading, and then you like wake up and you're hanging out with Pac-Man or something in the computer, right? That's not how it would work. So even the scientists who think mind uploading might be possible, really what they're doing is brain cloning. And there's vast disagreement about what is the difference between the brain and the mind, right? And if you have a clone, you don't have immortality of the original personal agent. You just have immortality of the data that was their brain, right? So this is the way sci-fi side of it right now still. There's still vast disagreement on what's possible. Artificial intelligence, we've seen a lot change in 10 years, but there are others that, there are many that think we're going to hit another AI winter and there's not going to be a lot of change in artificial intelligence for another long time. So a lot of that is still way out there, but the way it challenges us is, like I said, we're increasingly comfortable with interaction with artificial intelligence, interacting with machines. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying if you talk to Siri, you're going to end up wanting to live immortally inside of a computer. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is those little decisions are shaping the way we think about what it means to be human, what we think about what it means to be in a relationship, right? One of the just, I think, saddest things that I saw in researching some of this came out in the work of Sherry Turkle, who is a sociologist at MIT, and she studied a lot of different robotic interactions, and she has a book called Alone Together. And she's talking about some of the relational impacts of artificial intelligence. And the saddest one is that there are many places now that are basically using robot companions in nursing homes for elder care. Because as people get old, no one's visiting them, and they need some sort of companionship, and so we can do robots. We can just give them a companion robot that can talk to them, right? And so, she studied this, and this book was published almost 10 years ago, where she's talking about this. Someone from last night's forum actually emailed Dr. Bashirs and I a link just this morning to like a $67 million Israeli capital, I think it was a capital injection into a company that's doing this in Israel, that's creating these companion robots for elder care, right? So again, if you talk to Siri, I'm not going to say you're going to give your mother a robot instead of ever visiting her in the nursing home or something like that. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that we need to be careful about the steps that we're taking and the impact that they have on what we think it means to be human, what we think it means to be in a relationship with another person, so that we don't so easily buy into some of these, I think, compromises with such things. All right, so quickly, I've got 5 minutes before questions toward a response. Now, let me be clear with this book. I did not write this book because I think I know the solutions. I wrote this book because I found the interaction between humans and technology and the way that it's changing us just be a fascinating thing to study and try to understand. And it was something that I felt like too many Christians just think, technology's no big deal. As long as I don't sin on my smartphone, I'm okay. But there's more to it than that, and I wanted to draw some of that out. I don't know what the solution is. I don't think that there's like a 3 checkbox solution. That would just be a rudimentary form of an algorithm, so we would just be back to technology, right? But as we move or try to think about what types of responses we might have, I think first of all we can identify some major problems here. What does it mean to be human? Right? There's a very different picture here on what it means to be human among transhumanists, even among Christian transhumanists, which are now much more prominent than when I did the research for the book. So I don't talk about them a lot in the book, but there are growing numbers of Christians who are embracing transhumanism and are using the logic of transhumanism to, I think, change what it means to be human. What is the main problem that humans face? How can that problem be solved, right? We saw all this in the quote from that the secular transhumanist Novel Harari is his last name, Noah Harari. The meat suits the problem, right? We don't need God. We don't need the second coming. Geeks in a lab can do it, right? So we see something there about what the problem is and what the solution is. And we have to remember as Christians that that's not the problem, and therefore that's not the solution, right? Second, when it comes to theological innovation related to these things, we have answers to these questions. So the question then becomes, do we need to update our answers? Do we need to modify our answers? Or do we need to defend our answers in a new way? Do we need to defend the idea of what's really wrong with humanity is related to sin and the fall? Or is that an old idea that needs cast off, that's just distracting us from our chance to move beyond what we currently are? Finally, in the book, I use a few kind of ideal ideal ideas, I'll say. Because I think part of what we need to do is we need to remember some of the good of being human and being in relationship and being in places together and not just on our technology. And we need to think of ways creatively to hold on to some of those things, even if we don't do them in the exact same way. So I'll try to explain these really quickly, and then we'll get to questions that you all have. The first is the idea of the storyteller. How many of you remember a time when you had, long ago, when you had a friend who went on a vacation and you didn't know where they were, you didn't know when they were coming back, but then they came back, and then like a few days later they'd gone to the 1-hour photo, and then they invited you over and you sat around and looked at photos, and they told you about their trip. And there were laughs, and it was fun, and you were drawn into it, and you left that feeling closer to them, right? Now, some of you are like, yeah, that happened like once, and there's like the annoying times too. Granted, it doesn't always work well. I said these are ideals. Right? Now what happens when people go on vacation? Well, you know where they're going because they haven't shut up about it for 6 months. They've been posting pictures and comments constantly since they left. They're like, check out my bags, hope they make weight, right? Every step, and by the time they get back, you wish they'd just stay gone and stop posting about it, right? And so this notion of the storyteller, again, as an ideal, is meant to point to remind us that there's something about being present together, taking the patience to tell stories, to talk about life, to love each other by drawing each other in, and to build relationships in that way. Our technology can tempt us to skip all of that because there's much more efficient ways to share that information. But efficiency isn't necessarily a value here, right? Second is the notion of neighbor. One of the things that we can wrongly buy into with digital technology is that we're around a whole bunch of people when we're online, right? But really what social networks are really good about is filtering who you actually interact with. You tend to interact with people who think just like you, or people who think so differently from you that they just really make you angry every time you read it. Those are like the two extremes, because that's going to keep you engaged, and that's what the social media companies want to do. They want to keep you engaged, so they know you'll be engaged with your friends, people like you, think like you, similar background as you, and you'll be engaged by the people who are so obviously wrong that you now feel smarter having read their dumb post and responded to it. It keeps you engaged. The person who's about halfway in between, who actually makes some really good points that make you a little uncomfortable, you're probably not going to see their stuff, because that doesn't keep you engaged in the way that the social media companies want you engaged. That makes you think, right? So this idea of neighbor needs reclaimed. We need to remember that our neighbors are those that we just bump into. I think that's the story of the Good Samaritan, right? That story comes out of someone asking Jesus the question, who's my neighbor? And he doesn't say, well, whose mailbox is next to yours? He tells a story of a traveler who bumps into someone. Traveling bumps into someone, right? Someone not like them at all, that would not have been on their street, would not have been their neighbor, right? So we need to be reminded that even though digital technology does provide some sorts of connections and does claim to provide some sort of community, we have to also recognize that it insulates us and isolates us from the very people that maybe the Lord wants us to be bumping into. So this notion of neighbor, especially related to that story in the Gospels, reminds us of that. Also then, friends, just remembering that there's something about friendship that is deeper than just, oh, I happen to know you. Friendship's a commitment to the future. It's based on a promise of a better life together than either of us can have alone, as one scholar puts it in talking about the good of friendship. And finally, really quickly, I try to bring these together in the book. And so you'll just have to read the book if this doesn't make sense to you. I try to bring this together in the idea of the potluck. I was like, what's something where these three ideals can come together? And part of this also gets at technology tempts us to think efficiency is always better. And it's not always efficient to make good food for people and to spend time together eating slowly like at potlucks tend to be. I know this isn't a Southern Baptist church like I grew up in. I don't know if there's a lot of potlucks around here. Probably not anymore, but maybe there used to be. A really good potluck. People are taking the time to make good food that they want to share. They're taking time, spending time together telling those stories, bumping into people, developing friendships. And so as an ideal, one that is probably laughable to many people, this idea of the potluck to me brings together some of those ideas, those things that I think we need to figure out ways to keep important to us, even as our technology advances, thinking about ways that we can make space, focus, pay attention, sacrifice efficiency for the sake of friendship, for the sake of life together as gospel communities. All right, questions?
I'm having a technology problem moment. Thank you very much for that. We have time for questions. This is being videoed and audio recorded, obviously. And so one of the things we'd like to do is to get a mic to you. Debbie's going to help as well. So if you want to just signal to me or to Debbie, that's Debbie in the back, that you have a question, we'll get to you as soon as we can. If we can, just a matter of Q&A hygiene. He'll take care of the answers. You supply the questions. But please supply questions and not position statements and so forth if you can. Sometimes you need to make a statement to set up your question. We understand that, of course, but we will try to move that forward as quickly as we can. So if we are ready to start, do we have a first question?
From everything you was talking about, I just wondered, you're talking about rationality. Where do you place the emotional side of human beings at? Because that's what spurs all these other things to try to be better at something, not the rational side.
Yeah. So I guess I think that's one of the aspects, at least in the transhumanists that I studied, that tended to be lacking. That there was such an emphasis on rationality that it maybe would tend to view emotions as something that would need to be overcome or regulated, rather than seeing them as something that could participate in some way with rationality to make us human and draw us in those directions.
Suzanne.
This is a simplistic question. Could you define transhumanism?
Yes. Transhumanism is a broad and loosely aligned group of philosophies, or we could say perspectives on life, that want to use advanced technology, advanced biotechnological engineering, advanced pharmaceuticals, to move beyond what we are as humans now into whatever the next thing is.
Yeah, up front. I got it.
You can hold it for next.
What would you say is the biggest danger that a transhumanist would pose if we're commanded as Christians to, take the world and subject it and to get it under our dominion? Isn't that what the transhumanist is trying to do?
Yeah, so I think that this is one of the difficult places where these things connect together. That Christians have certainly always understood what God calls us to do is to exercise dominion over the created world. The place where we see that, especially that connects to this, is areas like helping heal disease and things like that, right? So Christians have always wanted to and sacrificed themselves to be agents of healing and of blessing and things like that. So in some ways you can see some common cause, like Christians should be excited about technological advancements that help with suffering and things like that. I think where transhumanists tend to part company is where we have some sense of what it means to be human that's stable and enduring, and that ultimately was taken on and exemplified by Christ. I think in rejecting any idea of anything stable under the definition of human and saying we can change into whatever we want to be, I think that's where Christians have to, I think, simply be willing to say, no, we don't think that's humanity. Human is not something we construct. It's something that we receive. Our humanness is something we receive as a gift from God. and we can seek to alleviate suffering. We can seek to alleviate pain for God's glory. But we don't want to change and become something else. We want to be more human, not beyond human, and ultimately we do that through what Christ has done. So I think that's where you begin to divert between those two sensibilities. And where it's tough is that any kind of technological advancement could be used for ways that would fit with a Christian worldview. I think maybe I wouldn't want to say any. Many would fit with a Christian perspective on reality, but then that same technology could be turned around and used to subvert what it means to be human, to pursue one of these other agendas. Which is why it's not like you can make two lists. These are the technologies Christians can use, these are the technologies they can't. It's not that simple. It comes down to also how we're using them and then how they're shaping us.
Yeah, you mentioned in the beginning, you talked about the desire to control, and one of the things that would seem very, unfortunately, too prevalent in our society is the whole transgender movement, using medicine and science to change our gender. Does that fit into this whole thing?
Yeah, so it's definitely connected to the same thinking of what it means to be human biologically. So there's this growing sense in our culture that there is something unrelated to our bodies that's truly us. And that should be given power to change the body in whatever way it needs to. And gender dysmorphia is a big one with that, where we hear people describing as being born into the wrong body. But there are other forms of dysmorphia as well that have been studied. There are people who claim, I have two good arms, but I don't really have two good arms. Truly me, I only have a left arm, so I want to have my right arm amputated. And so then the question becomes, if you're a doctor and this person comes to you, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to do no harm. Well, but they don't actually take the Hippocratic Oath anymore, mostly. But also, this person claims that it's actually harmful for them to be having the arm, right? So there's this whole discussion now, and because our culture lacks a foundation to say, no, this is what it means to be human, we're really struggling how to answer those things. And it's scary, because once you remove the arm, it's gone, right? And in the area of gender dysmorphia, I mentioned earlier how there are studies about the impact of digital technology now, but we really need to see 30 years out to have a better idea. Those changes and things too, I think that the studies that are beginning to come in even now are about the number of people that doesn't actually solve the problem that they're feeling, right? And so I think that they're certainly related, and I think that the temptation for me is to exaggerate those, or almost make it seem like, oh, come on, you know what you were, obviously you're born to have two arms. Let's stick with that one, it's less controversial. So I think as Christians, we're in this really strange place where we do have to stand firmly with what Scripture has revealed and who God has created us to be. But we also have to be really careful not to throw those people who are genuinely experiencing difficulty and suffering. We have to also respond to them with pastoral love and care and true love, not just, oh, okay, what's true for you is true for you. No, we need to tell them the truth, but we need to figure out how to do that in a loving way. And that's hard, because these are really serious and deep issues for many of these people. And so it's a difficult one, because I think for many Christians it's just so far out there that they can't imagine someone actually thinking that they then struggle to respond in a good way.
Other questions? My turn. We spoke a little briefly at dinner about the issue of Solzhenitsyn having famously saying that man has forgotten God. And the older I get, I said, don't start your question with a statement, but the older I get, the more I find that's the diagnosis all the time. We truly have forgotten who we are, and as a result, we can't answer the most simple moral questions. If you ask a secular person whether humans are good or bad, they'll be either they have a dogmatic answer, or they'll be really stuck if they think about it. And I think this is a great failure of the church, not only in outreach, but a failure in the church in its ability even to bring its congregation along to understand that Christianity and the Christian worldview is something that refreshes places that other beers don't reach, as they used to say, you know? And what do you think is the one thing, I know you talked about various issues that the church could take on. What do you think would be, first of all, how do you feel about that diagnosis, but also what is the one thing that you think the church could do to begin to put forward a worldview which people would find attractive enough that they could begin to have a more balanced attitude toward these kinds of issues and opportunities?
Yeah, so I certainly think that the forgetting of God is one of the obvious factors here. I mean, even in that quote that I had towards the beginning where we don't need the second coming, geeks in a lab can do it. I mean, talk about raging against the divine, right? And it's startling, but at least they're honest. You know, there are many people that we know that feel that way, but just aren't honest about it. So at least they're honest. But as far as what the church can do, I think that part of what we have to do is not try to know what the latest technology is necessarily, but actually know what the faith handed down over generations actually is. And I think the more that we know the truth, the more we will be able to sense some of these tricks that are coming down through these other things. It's just the classic example of, you know, someone who's trained to identify counterfeit money. They don't study counterfeit money, they study the real thing, and then they can know the counterfeits, right? So it's the same thing. I think the church's response to this needs to be biblical and theological education, and also awareness of some of these cultural factors. But also, I just think that there are some obvious places where these technologies are going to touch us that are pretty easy to draw lines in the sand. And I hope that in 40 years, Christians are still known as people who do not kill persons who are not yet born, who do not kill persons who are old and suffering and might want to die, and who also don't get those people robots. So in other words, I think maintaining the life issues at the beginning of life and the end of life, but also having a more holistic approach to what the good life is and how to be a community that helps young families and young people with young children with the economic challenges, but also that continues to help people as they age and as they begin to despair and begin to lose friends and might want to travel to one of these countries that does euthanasia, right? And not just say, oh, don't go do that, here's a robot, but actually find ways to still have them in community with us. I think that those are some big things that we could commit to that I'd be glad to see.
Jeffrey?
Yeah, other than your book, what other resources would you highly recommend that Christians should be attentive to, should check out? What other Christian thinkers, scholars, and resources would you necessarily recommend?
Yeah, so again, I guess my main push would be encouraged to dive deeper into biblical and theological truth and what you can learn from church history and things like that. But as far as studying more on issues of technology and things like that, there are places in some books where these issues are being highlighted. I know you all had Rod Dreher here. There's a chapter in his book about technology and some of the challenges that it's posing that I think is very good. Ben Sass's book, I forget the title of that book. Anybody remember the newer one? Ben Sass.
The Vanishing American Adult or something?
I think that's it. He also has a chapter on technology in that where he looks at technology and with some of those issues. Those are helpful treatments. There's a theologian named Craig Gay who teaches at Regent in Vancouver, who had a book come out. I've forgotten the title of it, but I think it has automation in the title. It's looking in particular at challenges that artificial intelligence and automation will be bringing potentially in the next 5 to 10 years, as far as our theology of work and things like that. So I don't really touch that issue as much in my work, but I think it's also an important one to think about for the church.
Over here.
I know you teach college students, and I don't know if you have children or not yet.
I do. I have 4.
Okay. So practically speaking, what do you see as helpful things to do in the home? What discussions or limits have you placed?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think I'll answer this both for children and for college students. I like that you brought both up. So with my children, on the one hand, we do give them limits. We don't, I mean, there's obviously stuff that we just don't let them do. But I mean, like they can watch TV and movies, and they have a Nintendo Switch. But it's fairly limited about the amount of time that they get to use it. It's often related to how much reading they do or playing outside. They're homeschooled. They read a lot. They read at least 90 minutes every day. So like they get a lot of reading in. So it's related to that. So we try to give them some limits, but we also try to give them lenses to see and words to use to talk about these things. And so my 8-year-old son, my second son, he loves commercials. He just loves screens. He just, anything, I mean, it could be a toilet paper commercial, and he's like glued to it, you know? And so we talk about that. I talk about that with him, and I say, Jack, I don't want you to grow up to be a man who can only be happy when he's looking at a screen. I want you to play with your siblings and your friends and talk to me and read, because I want you to be able to read and learn what you want to read and learn, and I want you to be able to read the Bible and know God, and I want you to be able to love people, right? So just giving him that little idea of, I don't want to be someone who always looks at screens. Like introducing him to that vocabulary and that idea and giving him a picture of what it means to be a godly man. And then trying to also not be someone myself who's always, using a screen. I have a friend who has 6 children, all older than mine. And when my first son was born, I asked him, he's an Irish Presbyterian pastor, and I asked him, how do you get your kids to love to read? Because he would always talk about how much they'd read. And he said 3 things. Have a house that's full of books, which you always hear. Read to your kids. You always hear that one too. But his third one was sometimes tell your kids to leave you alone while you're reading. In other words, if it's important to mom and dad, it'll be important to kids. And I've tried to do that, and I think it's worked. Like sometimes, sure, I'll put a book down and read to my kids, but sometimes I'll say, no, I need to finish what I'm reading. I think it's the same thing with technology, but the flip side of it, right? We need to actually show them that we can have fun without screens. And then as far as college students go, like I just try to talk about it with them and help them like remember that there's good that they're sacrificing when they're always on their screens. So in my classes, I have a no cell phone policy, no digital technology during class policy, but on the first day I say, let's make that, it's not just a during class time, it's in the classroom. So if you get here 5 minutes early, please don't sit on your phone. Stay in the hallway if you're going to do that. If you come in the room, talk to the people who are here. Because 5 years from now, you're going to be texting them, wishing you were with them, and you're with them now. So I try to just somewhat playfully, right? So not this screed from the professor, but somewhat playfully help them see. Again, I think a lot of this is helping people see, because all of us at some degree recognize that some of this is going awry. And we just need to help each other see that.
Other questions? Dan. Here, I thought you were AWOL.
That's an acronym. Well, in Silicon Valley and in these hyper advanced technological places, they do, even though they are kind of gung-ho, obviously, and visibly so, there is a certain sort of self-criticism. Google's motto, don't be evil, or whatever. What sort of, because I would like to think that people who have been to Cal Poly and done all these things and invented all these processes or programs or startup companies or whatever, that they've crashed into a number of walls in their experience. And so they're obviously going to go, well, what would a fail look like? Don't they ask themselves any sort of questions about, what could go wrong? Well, we think this is the future. We think we're doing great here, but couldn't this all just blow up? And what do they say among themselves about how this could blow up? Yeah,
well, I haven't seen a lot on that particular question, but one thing that I think that does speak to that is that it's been reported in various outlets that a lot of like Silicon Valley tech moguls don't let their kids use screens and pay lots of money to send their kids to schools that have no computers anything like that, all the while that they're pitching the rest of the country on, hey, have every kid have a tablet, right? And so I think one of the difficulties is it just shows that, I think capitalism is the best form of economics, compared to all the others, right? But it's not without its challenges, and one of its challenges is it rewards profits. And so that's a good thing, but it can also put people in the position where they can recognize, oh, I don't think this is good for my kid, but for my shareholders, I've got to do this, right? And we just don't have a very good mechanism for doing anything about that, I don't think. And so I'm not sure about discussions with other things. I mean, there's, I guess, Elon Musk, who's the CEO of Tesla and a few other major tech companies, really thinks that AI is going to take over the world and wipe us out. Like, it's an existential human threat at this point, according to him. And so occasionally we'll hear talk about that. But then Google's don't be evil thing, right? Well, who gets to decide what evil is or not, right? What is really, well, you see that as soon as they had that Department of Defense contract, right? They were going to actually help the government, and then a bunch of people went nuts and they quit, right? Oh, don't be evil. And helping the government must be evil, right? So even just that story showed that they don't have any substantive way to define what is evil. And so I don't know how much they're recognizing that and talking about it, but you kind of just let them do their thing and talk long enough, you start to see some of these inconsistencies. And granted, there are many godly, good Christian people working in all these industries that I'm sure see some of these things and wrestle with them and probably have better answers than I do too. And I don't want to iron over that either and make it seem like, oh, those people who work with technology or something like that.
One more.
My career was in the pharmaceutical business. Mm-hmm. And as we know, pharmaceutical science has improved the quality of life of a lot of people. Mm-hmm. One time, I worked for a very large international company. Our chairman CEO once made the comment regarding the future of pharmaceutical research. Made the statement, why do we think we cannot reverse the aging process? Mm. Now, does that sound like transhumanism or just a positive view of what research could accomplish in the future?
Yeah, I've certainly come across similar language that transhumanists would use, because one of the big enemies that they want to defeat is death, and pharmaceuticals are one of the tools that they would want to use for that. So I would say that statement would fit right in with transhumanist statements, but I could also see someone who wouldn't necessarily buy into the whole agenda of transhumanism still thinking reversing or slowing the aging process might be a good thing to pursue. So I would say all transhumanists would agree with that and would love that, but I don't think everyone necessarily that thinks that would buy into their whole thing as well. But I do think that, when we come to talk about somehow figuring out how to make ourselves immortal, which probably wasn't the exact language he was using, but we still, I think anytime we get to that where we're talking about human solutions to the ultimate problem, that really, I think God has clearly said, this is such a problem, I've got to come fix it. We should at least recognize, okay, we're exaggerating here or something like that. So I would be much more comfortable with talking about slowing the aging process or life extension of dozens of years, not thousands like many transhumanists are, but obviously that's a spectrum.
I think we just about run out of our time here. Will you be able to stay around for a while to interact with people?
I will be around.
Great. If you haven't had an opportunity to look at the book table in the back, there are Dr. Shatzer's book is back there for sale, as well as some things by the Areopagus and some books that have been important to presentations that we've had. If you're not signed up on our mailing list, there's an opportunity to do that as well, so you can find out about other presentations. We have